Mustache the iron oak. Two friends kneeling in the mud beneath an ancient tree during a violent storm. One of them will not leave this place alive. This much they will understand before the night ends. But the choice, when it comes, will not be theirs to make. 13 hours earlier, Mikhail's heavy boots sank into the churned mud at the base of the massive oak. Water streamed from the brim of his leather cap in rivulets. His wool coat, black with rain, clung to his shoulders like a second skin. Lightning split the sky, white and terrible. He pressed his back against the rough, cork-like bark, gasping for air as the wind tore at his clothes like something alive. The thunder that followed shook the earth beneath his feet. "Ivan, get under the canopy before the wind takes you." His voice was swallowed by the howl of the storm. But Ivan was already moving, a dark shape lunging through the deluge, hands gripping a low-hanging branch for stability. His face was pale, eyes wide, as another massive crack of thunder rattled through the air. The sound was no longer the sharp report of a distant explosion. It was close, intimate, as if the sky were splitting directly above them. Ivan pressed his back against a different section of the trunk, his chest heaving, his palms scraped raw against the bark. And then he felt it. A strange vibration behind the wood, rhythmic and purposeful, like the pulse of something vast and patient. "Do you feel that? The tree. It's humming, Mikhail." The words came out between gasps of breath, almost hysterical. Mikhail turned toward him, his eyes narrowing. He moved his fingers across the deep fissures in the bark where Ivan was pointing, feeling the strange resonance in the wood. His blunt fingernails found a rectangular seam hidden beneath layers of lichen and moss. A seam that had no business existing in the natural grain of a tree. He dug in. The wood groaned. His fingernails bent backward, but he didn't stop. And the pain became a distant thing, something happening to someone else. The seam gave way with a dry snap, like a bone breaking after months of being stressed. A wooden panel, 6 inches wide, fell open. Behind it was darkness, and something wrapped in rotted oilcloth. Ivan reached into the cavity with trembling hands. The cloth fell apart like diseased skin, crumbling beneath his fingers. What emerged from the wrapping was a leather-bound ledger, brittle with age, its cover scarred with a burnt-in symbol. 2 interlocking circles with a horizontal line cutting through them. The symbols seemed to catch the lightning, to glow for a moment with a light that came from nowhere. Mikhail leaned in, squinting as Ivan flipped the first page. The paper was yellowed and translucent, so fragile that the slightest pressure might tear it. His eyes locked onto a column of names written in iron gall ink, the kind of ink that had survived centuries without fading. At the top of the list, Mikhailov and Ivanov. Their surnames. Dated 1824. The wind seemed to pause. For a moment the storm held its breath. Mikhail's voice came out low, chilled. "Our families, even. Look, this isn't just a record. It's a list of debts." The rain fell harder as they made their way back. Minutes had passed since they'd found the ledger, but the storm showed no signs of abating. If anything, it had intensified, the wind now carrying the scent of ozone and something else, something like burnt hair. Ivan sprinted through the deluge, the ledger tucked tight under his arm like a football. His boots slipped on a slick patch of clay near the stone fence that marked the edge of the village proper. His shoulders slammed into the cold stone with a dull crack. Pain shot through his arm, a sharp, bright thing. But he didn't stop moving. A dark shape detached itself from the shadow of a haystack ahead. It moved with an unnatural speed, and Mikhail, who had been following 20 paces behind, saw Ivan's pace falter, saw his friend's head snap up in alarm. Mikhail accelerated without thinking. The mud sucked at his boots, slowing him, but he was faster. He had to be faster. The hooded figure lunged at Ivan with arms that seemed too long, too thin. Mikhail charged shoulder first, his entire body weight behind the collision. They went down together. A chaotic tangle of limbs and soaked fabric. Mikhail felt the cold metal surface of a blade whistle past his ear. So close, he felt the displaced air. The kiss of near death. Mikhail grabbed the stranger's wrist. He twisted it with everything he had, feeling the small bones shift and grind beneath his palms. There was a sickening pop, and the knife fell into the slush beside them. Mikhail delivered a brutal headbutt, the bridge of his nose connecting with the stranger's forehead. The impact sent starbursts across his vision. But the stranger groaned and rolled away, disappearing into the darkness of the woods like something that had never been solid at all. Mikhail lay in the mud, his breath coming in ragged gasps. His nose was broken. He could feel the bones shifting, the blood running warm down his upper lip. When he looked up, he saw Ivan crawling toward him, hand outstretched. Ivan's fingers came away from Mikhail's coat, stained with a black substance that wasn't mud. Mikhail watched as Ivan examined his own palm, watched the confusion cross his friend's face. The substance was thick, viscous like tar, and it didn't wash away in the rain. It smelled of burnt ozone. It smelled wrong. "What is that?" Ivan whispered. Mikhail didn't answer. He looked at the ledger, now muddy but intact, still clutched against Ivan's chest. The leather covers seemed to be moving slightly, pulsing in sync with the thundering of Mikhail's own heart. He could feel it vibrating in his bones, a frequency that existed just below conscious awareness, just below the threshold of pain. The workshop was cold. A single guttering tallow candle illuminated the heavy oak workbench where Ivan sat hunched over the ledger. The stone walls of the workshop seemed to press inward, and the shadows they cast were longer than they should have been, sharper, more defined. Ivan used a magnifying glass to inspect a page titled "The Tithe of the Oak." Each letter was written with careful precision, the handwriting of someone educated but trapped in a remote place. Someone recording something too important to be forgotten. His eyes scanned a sentence. "The sap runs red, so the harvest stays gold." Behind him, Mikhail paced. His hands were clasped behind his back so tightly the knuckles had turned white. Back and forth. Back and forth. The floorboards creaked beneath his feet, and the sound was like the groaning of the very earth. He stopped. He pointed to a small diagram at the bottom of the page. It showed a human heart intertwined with the roots of a tree, the anatomical drawing rendered in precise detail. But it was what lay next to the heart that froze the breath in Mikhail's lungs. A thumbprint made in dried, dark brown blood. "Turn the page," Mikhail said. Ivan did. The next page held a map of the village, hand-drawn with accurate detail despite its age. Certain houses were circled in red, Mikhail's house and Ivan's house. The circles were precise, purposeful, drawn by someone who knew exactly which buildings mattered. Underneath the map, a note. 7 generations. The payment is due upon the 8th storm. Neither man moved. The only sound was the distant wind, whistling through the cracks in the workshop walls, a sound like voices calling from very far away. Mikhail caught his own reflection in a dusty mirror on the wall. For just a moment, a fraction of a second that felt like an eternity. His face didn't look like his own. It was elongated, the skin gray and bark-like, the eyes hollow knots of wood. His mouth opened in a scream he didn't make. He blinked. His normal face looked back at him from the mirror, terrified and mortal and absolutely alive. "It's changing us, Ivan," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the wind. "The tree, it remembers the debt." Morning came, but it brought fog instead of light. The village square was obscured by thick, white mist that moved in patterns that didn't seem to follow any natural wind. Mikhail walked through it carefully, his senses heightened, his breath misting in the cold. He saw the blacksmith, Gregor, standing motionless in the middle of the road, staring up at the sky as if waiting for something to descend. Gregor's skin looked wrong, pale, almost translucent, as if the fog were passing through him rather than around him. Mikhail reached out to touch Gregor's shoulder. In that instant, something ancient and predatory woke behind Gregor's eyes. His head snapped around with animalistic speed, a motion that should have broken a human neck. His eyes were gone. In their place, solid black pits that seemed to recede infinitely inward. He roared. The sound was like a tree trunk splitting lengthwise, wet wood screaming as it tore apart. Gregor's arm came up with the iron sledgehammer he'd been holding at his side, invisible in the fog until the last moment. The hammer whistled through the air where Mikhail's head had been. Mikhail dodged, instinct older than thought, and the hammer smashed into a wooden market stall behind him, sending shards of timber flying like shrapnel. Mikhail lunged forward, driving his shoulder into Gregor's chest. They went down together, Mikhail hammering his fists into Gregor's face. But the skin felt like hitting a tire, rubbery, unresponsive, as if Mikhail were pounding on something that had never been alive, in the traditional sense. A log appeared from the fog. Ivan. Ivan was there, swinging a heavy firewood log with both hands, connecting with the back of Gregor's knees with a sound like a baseball bat hitting wet concrete. Gregor went down with a low, vibrating hum that built and built until it seemed the air itself was shaking. Mikhail and Ivan scrambled away. More figures emerged from the mist. Villagers, all of them moving with that same unnatural speed, all of them wearing that same empty expression. But their eyes were wrong. Their eyes were full of something that had no name, something that existed behind the facade of the human form. Mikhail grabbed Ivan's arm and they ran. The cellar was cool and deep and utterly silent. Stone walls pressed in from all sides, and the darkness beyond the reach of the lantern seemed absolute. The kind of darkness that had weight and substance. Ivan was hunched over the ledger on the dirt floor, sweat dripping from his brow, leaving a smudge of dirt on his cheek. He wiped at it with the back of his hand, smearing it further. His fingers were trembling as they traced the pages. He found a page with a fresh blood stain over their names. The blood was wet. He could smell it. But that was impossible. The book was old. Centuries old. There was no reason for fresh blood to appear on its pages. Ivan scratched at the blood stain with his fingernail. Underneath, a sentence had appeared. The ink looked wet, dark, still glistening in the lantern light. One branch must fall so the forest may live. Below it, the names Mikhail and Ivan were joined by a single word in harsh, angular letters. Or. The cellar door creaked. Footsteps on the stairs. Mikhail emerged from the shadows, holding an iron poker from the fireplace. His knuckles were white, pressed so hard against the metal that his fingernails had turned blue from the pressure. Ivan watched as his friend's eyes tracked to him, to the ledger in his hands, back to Ivan's face. "What did you find?" Mikhail's voice was cold, stripped of all the warmth of 30 years of friendship. "Why are you hiding it?" Ivan stood up slowly, his back pressing against the cold stone wall. He gripped the ledger tight. He looked at the poker in Mikhail's hand, at the way his friend's shoulders were tensed, at the murder focus in his eyes. The friendship of 30 years evaporated in the cold cellar air. replaced by something older and deeper. Animal survival instinct. "Don't come closer," Ivan said. Mikhail came closer. Mikhail lunged, reaching for the ledger with both hands. Ivan swung the book at his friend's face, the paper edges cutting Mikhail's cheek open. Mikhail roared, an animal sound, and tackled Ivan into a shelf of preserves. Glass jars exploded in a cascade of sound, coating them both in red beet juice that looked exactly like gore. Ivan kicked Mikhail off him and scrambled toward the cellar door. He looked back and saw several figures standing at the top of the stairs, blocking the light. They were dressed in rags from the 1800s. Ivan recognized the face of his own great-great-grandfather from an old tintype that hung in his mother's parlor. But the eyes were hollow, absent, replaced with something that was watching from very far away, across impossible distances. The figures stood in absolute silence. They didn't speak. They didn't move. They simply existed at the threshold between the cellar and the world above, a barrier that was more than physical. Mikhail grabbed the ledger from the floor during the distraction. He shoved past the frozen Ivan and charged at the figures on the stairs. He swung the iron poker. The metal passed right through the first figure as if it were made of smoke, and Mikhail felt a sudden lurch in his perception, a spinning sensation in his inner ear. He tumbled down the stairs, fell through the man like falling through open air, and crashed onto the grass outside. The grass was wet with dew. The fog had lifted slightly. In the distance, the ancient oak stood like a sentinel, its massive trunk silhouetted against the pre-dawn sky. Mikhail climbed to his feet, the ledger clutched in his hand, and began to run. He kneeled at the base of the iron oak as the sky darkened to black. The tree's bark seemed to pulse with an internal light, a sickly luminescence that came from no visible source. Mikhail had a tin of kerosene and a box of matches. He dosed the ledger in the clear, sharp-smelling liquid until the leather cover was dripping with it. The rhythmic thumping from inside the tree was so loud now that it shook the ground beneath his knees. Thump, thump, thump. Like a heartbeat. Like the beating of something vast and ancient and awake. A match flared to life in Mikhail's hand. The flame was small and fragile, but it was real. It was here. It was now. Before he could drop it onto the kerosene-soaked ledger, a massive root burst from the ground like a breaching whale. It slammed into Mikhail's chest with the force of a truck, throwing him back 10 feet into the mud. The impact drove the air from his lungs. The match was extinguished. Mikhail gasped, tasting blood. His ribs screamed with pain, cracked, maybe broken. 3 smaller, vine-like roots snaked out of the darkness and wrapped around his ankles, constricting like snakes, pulling him backward toward the trunk. He clawed at the mud, his fingernails tearing as he tried to find purchase, tried to find something solid to hold on to. The roots dragged him inexorably backward, dragged him into the shadow of the ancient tree, dragged him toward the hollow at its base. Ivan walked out of the fog carrying an axe. He stopped 5 feet from Mikhail, who was pinned against the trunk by the roots, his back pressed into the bark, his legs stretched out before him. Ivan's face was illuminated by a flash of lightning. He was smiling, but his eyes were streaming with black, oily tears. "They told me, Mikhail." Ivan's voice was shaky, desperate, the voice of a man making a choice that would destroy him. "They told me one of us serves the tree, and the other lives. I have a family. You have no one." Mikhail looked at Ivan, then at the ledger lying just out of reach, still wet with kerosene. He looked at his friend's face and saw the war happening behind his eyes. The terrible mathematics of survival, the calculus of which life mattered more. The roots began to pull Mikhail's arm into the bark of the tree. The wood was softening like wet clay, warm and pliable and alive. His arms sank inch by inch, the bark closing around his forearm, his elbow climbing toward his shoulder. He didn't scream, even raised the axe over his head, preparing to strike Mikhail's neck. The blade was dull from years of disuse, but it would work. It would do what needed to be done. "For the village," Ivan whispered. His muscles tensed for the downward swing. With his free hand, Mikhail fumbled in his pocket. His fingers found the last dry match, the final one he'd been saving without knowing why. He struck it against the rough, absorbing bark of the tree. The match flared. The sound the fire made as it ignited was like a living thing taking its first breath. Orange bloomed into being, spreading from Mikhail's kerosene-soaked sleeve to his shoulder, consuming the bark that had begun to absorb him. The fire climbed. The fire spread. It touched the ledger. Ivan was blown back as the kerosene-soaked ledger and the tree ignited. The fire wasn't orange. It wasn't red or yellow or any natural color that fire could be. It was green. A sickly, brilliant green that seemed to come from somewhere outside the visible spectrum. The tree emitted a high-pitched, human-like shriek that shattered the windows of the nearby village houses, that sent every dog within 5 miles running blind with panic, that seemed to tear something open in the fabric of reality itself. Inside the green furnace, Mikhail's face was calm. The roots that held him were curling and blackening, retreating into the wood, recoiling from the heat like living things pulling back from a flame. The ledger on the ground turned to white ash, and as it burned, the names of the families, Mikhailov, Ivanov, glowed briefly, brightly, then vanished forever. The fire crackled and roared and consumed. And Mikhail didn't look away. Ivan stood before the blackened, dead husk of the oak on the following dusk. The tree was charred, burned down to a skeletal remnant of what it had been. The village was silent. There were no people visible anywhere, no animals, no movement except for the fog, which drifted across the ground in slow, purposeful patterns. He looked down at his hand. The black tar from the stranger, the substance that wouldn't wash away, had moved up his arm. It now covered his chest, creeping up his neck in tendrils that looked almost like roots. It didn't hurt. That was the terrible part. It didn't hurt at all. It felt like being reclaimed by something ancient that had always owned him anyway. Ivan walked toward the fog. His body was becoming translucent. He could see through his own hands, could see the mist beyond them. He heard Mikhail's voice, not from the air, but from inside his own head. A rhythmic and steady sound like a heartbeat, like the pulse of the earth itself. He stepped into the mist. His boots left no prints in the mud. Deep beneath the village, in the spaces where the soil became stone, where the stone became something older and harder than stone, the roots had grown back. They were white and fleshy, pulsing with a luminescent sap that flowed like blood through their vessels. They had woven around the skeletons of the village's founders, the first Mikhailovs and Ivanovs, the ones who had made the pact in 1824. They had grown through bone, had incorporated the dead into their structure until it was impossible to tell where the roots ended and the skeletons began. And at the very center, 2 new bodies were perfectly preserved. Mikhail and Ivan. Their hands were joined by a root that looked like a spinal cord, connected not by death, but by something far more intimate. By the web of obligation and debt that stretched backward through generations, forward into an unknown future. They would never rot. They would never decay. They would simply be here, beneath the village, beating a slow and patient rhythm through the chambers of the earth. Above ground, on the charred stump of the iron oak, A new sprout was already emerging. It was bright green, vibrant with obscene life, pushing up through the blackened wood with an insistence that couldn't be denied. On its tiny first leaf, the same cryptic symbol from the ledger had appeared naturally in the structure of the veins. Two interlocking circles with a horizontal line cutting through them. The debt was not paid. It had only changed shape. It had only begun to grow again.